Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. And the one who was seated on the throne said, See, I am making all things new. Also, he said, Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true. Then he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life. It's that first verse. Listen to it. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. There are those who read this verse who believe that this world, this universe, will ultimately come to an end and that God will replace it with some kind of new heaven and new earth. I want to say I'm fairly sure they're mistaken. I don't want to be rude, but I do. I think they're mistaken. Because how we read this verse, this simple verse, is really a big deal. Because if those people are right, then it actually means we can use this world up and then eventually just throw it away. We can drive it as if it were a rental car with full insurance. It would mean that this world doesn't really matter because that one day we're going to get a new one. And not only that, it also affects how we think about God and how we relate to God. Because if this world doesn't matter, and all that really matters is the new heaven and the new earth, then all I have to worry about is whether I'm going to get into that new heaven and into that new earth, whether the pearly gates of the new Jerusalem are going to be opened for me. And we know that there are millions of Christians across the world who believe that that's what Christianity, and perhaps not only Christians, but people who believe that that's what Christianity is about. It's just about whether we make it into heaven or not. So how we understand this first verse of Revelation 21 really matters. It's a big deal. And the thing which catches my eye, maybe it did yours as well, that catches my eye in the opening verse is that phrase, because it's a peculiar one, and the sea was no more. I have a few friends for whom heaven without an ocean would be no heaven at all, but that's obviously not what this means. To the ancients, the sea was a place of dark, unpredictable forces, inhabited by these strange creatures, some that were larger than boats, others with teeth and mouths that could eat human beings, some with tentacles who would disappear in a squirt of dark liquid. And the sea itself could quickly change its mind and move from calm into a raging storm. It increased its tides and decreased its tides. It would sink boats and suck people into its depths. And so in our passage today, the sea is actually a metaphor for these unexplained tragedies, these unexplained sufferings that go on in our world. The sea is the place where all the things which have made us, and we all know this well, the sea is the place where all the things which have made us cry out, why God did this have to happen in the world or to me? That's where all our whys are found, is in the sea. That sea is filled with the tears of our grief. And so the phrase, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away and the sea was no more, is not a description of the world coming to an end, but instead is a description of the state of the world that we live in now, that coming to an end. So it's important to understand that the new heaven and the new earth don't replace the old heaven and earth. Instead, the new heaven and the new earth is this world, this universe restored and renewed. If you like, it's this world finally made right. It's when the lion lies with the lamb. And that is, by the way, why there is so much wonder and beauty in our world already, which we discern in all kinds of ways. Because heaven is already here. We already are able to taste heaven. It's just not here completely. It's not here perfectly. We are still surrounded by the deep, dark sea. But, says John the Revelator, the time is coming when God will make his home, it's a picture of like a physical, a presence, his home amongst us. And in this new world, when that happens, where God is completely present and the sea is no more, John writes, he will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first things have passed away. The first things. The first way, the way we know the world now, that's going to pass away. And there will be a new heaven and a new earth. And so John writes in verse 5, and the one who was seated on the throne said, see, I am making all things new. Also he said, write this, for these words are trustworthy and true. Won't you listen with me now? Listen to every word. Notice them. Perhaps even come back to it. But listen to every word. John writes, see, I am making all things new. God is already busy. It's a present tense phrase. It's not he has made things new. He will make things new. He is busy making all things new. And John invites us to see, to look, to notice. It's happening. It is happening all around us. And then, just in case we find it too hard to believe that is actually going on, in case we find it too hard to believe that a new heaven and a new earth are on their way, just in case the deep, dark sea distracts us too much, we feel too overwhelmed by the presence of all this grief and suffering and pain, Jesus says, through John, says, write this because for these words are trustworthy and true. Jesus says, these simple words that we read this morning, these are words we can build our lives upon. This is a promise from God that we can depend upon. These words, this promise is trustworthy and true. It's quite a thing, trustworthy and true. We can build our lives upon it. One of my most important mentors in ministry said to me about 20 years ago that one day the church would eventually come to accept, welcome, and affirm gay people. And he went on to say, and that many would eventually come to recognize the harm that the church had caused while we were still learning to discover the heart of God around this thing. And at the time, it was such a hot topic in the church, I was disbelieving. The idea that might be possible seemed impossible, because this whole homosexuality thing was so contentious in the church. But my mentor was absolutely sure. I said to him, really? But his certainty played a huge role in my own wrestling with the issue. It was because of his certainty that I wanted to explore and understand more deeply than I had already. Because I thought, man, if God is up to something, if my mentor is right, if this is one of the ways in which God is busy making all things new, then I want to look, I want to see, I want to be there, I want to notice what God is up to. It was my mentor's absolute confidence in the promise of God that he was making all things new that set me on my journey of discovery on this issue. I know we speak about him a lot, but let me tell one final story. One of the things that I've admired most about the life of Desmond Tutu was that he had this absolute clarity that apartheid would come to an end. You might have seen some of the videos of sermons and things, speeches that he's given. It's remarkable to listen to him. He has this absolute clarity that the injustice of that system would come to an end. Even when our country was at its most violent, when civil war seemed inevitable, this diminutive priest was completely clear. This injustice will end. That the one who is seated on the throne, the real king, the real president, that the one who was seated on the throne of heaven was saying, "See, I am making all things new." Tutu couldn't say when it would happen, but he was absolutely certain that it was coming. He didn't hope it would end. He knew it would end because he believed the promise of God, the one who sits on the throne, that he was busy making all things new. And then what's important to recognize, that it was out of that clarity, it was out of that conviction that Tutu went about the work of justice. It was out of that conviction that he joined hands with the God who is busy making all things new. He said, "I want to be a partner with you in this work." And as you'll know from things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he was often brought to tears by the many injustices that he witnessed in this world. He was brought to tears by the big dark sea that still surrounds us. But despite that, he continued to speak and work with courage and confidence. And what I think one of the greatest giveaways of his confidence in God's promise was that infectious sense of humor. Imagine laughing in the midst of so much pain. Imagine being able to find joy in the midst of so much pain. He did because he knew. He knew that God was already making all things new. This curious book of Revelation was written for people of faith who were suffering all kinds of challenges and crises and persecutions and grief. We can read it for ourselves today because we are also people differently, but we also suffer in our own way. And when John finishes the book, he wants us, his readers, to be clear about at least two things. Firstly, he wants us to know that the day is coming when the sea will be no more. No more. No more. The time is coming when our suffering will cease, when things will be put right. And so he says, hold on. Don't give up. Live, believe in the promise. And secondly, which is related to that, I think John wants us to be aware as the followers of Jesus. He wants to extend to us an invitation to join the God who is already at work to bring this new world into being, to look and to see and to join hands with that God. I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more.